Today's date is June 24th, 1997. The survivor is Elvira Pfeffer. The interviewer is Molly Horowitz. It's taking place in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, United States, and the language is English. My name is Molly Horowitz. I am conducting an interview with Elvira Pfeffer in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, United States. Today's date is June 24th, 1997. What is your name, and please spell?
My name is Elvira Pfeffer, Elvira Pfeffer.
And what was your name at birth, and spell that, please?
Elvira Unger, Elvira Unger.
Were you known ever by any other name?
As a child, I was referred to as Litzie.
How do you spell that?
Licie.
And what was the date of your birth?
I was born October 22nd, 1931.
And that makes your current age?
65 and a half.
What was the city and country of your birth, and spell that, please?
I was born in a town that in Yiddish was referred to as Salem, spelled C-E-L-E-M, and in German was called Deutschkreuz.
How do you
D-E-U-T-S-C-H-R-E-U-Z. I missed a few letters there. K.
K.
Missed a K, right. Shall I start again?
Why don't you spell that again?
D-E-U-T-S-C-H-K-R-E-U-Z.
Let's talk about Salem. What size of a town was Salem?
It was a small town compared to Pittsburgh, about a half hour from Vienna. It was one of the provinces in Austria, which was part of what was called in Hebrew or Yiddish the Sheva Kehilos, which means the 7 states, communities. Those 7 communities were in a certain part of southern Austria and had probably been established in about 1645. The government that was there at the time was the Esterhazy dynasty, and they were quite lenient on the Jewish community. The people that lived there paid taxes and obeyed the laws, and were given latitude as far as their religious observances were concerned. Most of the people in these communities, Jewish people in those communities, were observant, although in the main they were Gentile communities. The largest of them, it was called Eisenstadt. The other 2 that I remember, one was called Mattersdorf and one was called Nickelsburg.
In Salem, about how many Jews were there?
Well, I think there may have been 200 families, and it was in the form of a kehila, which means that there was an authority, and the community asked all their questions and responded to the authority that went according to the Jewish law, the Torah or halacha as we call it.
And who was this authority for the town of Salem?
In my recollection, it was a rabbi whose name was Rabbi Levi Yitzchak Grunwald. I believe that he became the Rav in the town about the time of my birth. My mother actually was married into this town. My father's family had lived there for about 4 or 5 generations. And the language spoken was German, and this Rav was the authority that the Jewish community listened to.
Let's talk about your family a bit. Where was your father born?
My father was born in Salem. He had told me that originally his family had come from Spain, which must have been probably in the early 1600s. But they had lived in this community from about the time that it was established. As a matter of fact, this Rav is was a third cousin to my father.
Did they ever talk about the origin of the name Unger, the family name?
As far as I know, the name Unger referred to a person of Hungarian origin. So it's possible that in the travels they went by way of Hungary.
What do you know about your father's youthful days? What did he do when he was a very young man?
My father or most families were observant. My father's family was observant, and there were the whole family was observant as far as what here in America or in Pittsburgh would be considered Orthodox. There were 2 strains in the family. One was the rabbinic strain, and the other one was more of a commerce kind of a strain. My father was the commerce brother. He had a brother who was very intellectually steeped in Jewish knowledge. As a matter of fact, he became the son-in-law in one of these other Sheva Kehilos and eventually became the town rabbi. So he, in Israel and in Europe, was referred to as the Materstorfer Rav because he married the daughter of that Rav. My father was in business. He went to school probably till the age of 20 more in the Hebraic studies, and then he...
Where did he study?
He studied in a small town that was close to one of these Sheva Kehilos because there were quite a few schools of Torah study in these communities. He was sent away from home. At the moment it escapes me. If it comes back to me, I'll mention it again.
By the way, we also did not ask what his name was. What was his name?
My father's name in Jewish and Hebrew was Yehuda Leib Ungar, and in his familiar name he was referred to as Leib. And
what sort of business was your father in when you were a little girl?
From the time my father married, he went into business. We had a granary, which means that we milled the grain into flour and sold it.
And with who were your customers, or your father's customers?
I would imagine it was people that would be reselling these products. We had employees that helped in this. I remember we had an office. My mother helped in the business, and we were very familiar with our employees, many of whom were not Jewish, most of whom were not Jewish. As a matter of fact, later on, we turned our material goods over to the people that worked for us when we left.
What was your father, when you were a small child, do you remember seeing your father at home a lot, or when did you see your father at home?
Yes,
being that he was a businessman.
I saw my father a lot. I was very close to my father. I was the only girl. I have a brother who is a year and a half older than I am, And of course, we had holidays and Shabbosim and Yomim Tovim, and we lived on the same plot as the business, so that I really did see my father most of the time. He traveled to Vienna on business quite a bit, and that was just for the day.
Was your father involved with yours and your brother's education?
My father was very involved in the community. He was involved in the hiring of the Kehillah people that worked in the Kehillah, and he was definitely involved in our education, although we didn't get too far in our education before the war broke out.
Tell me now about your mother. What was her name? What is her name?
My mother is living in Pittsburgh. Her name was in Europe was Regina Frieda, and her maiden name was Hollander. So presumably there was something to do with Holland. I don't know what. And in America, she's been referred to as Frieda. Her Hebrew name was Rivka, or is Rivka.
What do you remember of your mother's role at home when you were a young child?
My mother was very actively involved in rearing me, although we did have, I wouldn't call them servants exactly. I would say they were household help, really. And she was quite active in participating in my development. And both my parents were kind of European in the way we were reared, but I think my mother was always a disciplinarian in our family, as she still is today.
You mentioned household help. Who were the people who were household help?
I can't remember their names. I do know there was a maid in the house, and then there was a cleaning person. And I remember people in the office, and I just can't recall their names.
What sort of role did the housemaid have other than cleaning duties?
Well, you see, we didn't have washers, we didn't have dryers, we didn't have dishwashers, we didn't have diaper service, and so all these household chores that are done mechanically today were done with elbow grease by people. So it's reasonable to believe that if you had a house of a reasonable size, which we had, definitely had a large home, there was a lot of work that went into keeping it up, as we say.
Describe your home.
I remember my room very distinctly. I remember I had white furniture. I remember that our office was part of right next to our living quarters. Our office, as a matter of fact, had a roof that was removable for Sukkot. And I remember every year that the roof kind of slid back, and we had our meals and did our living in that room on that holiday. My father's family lived in that community, and so we really had a lot of communication with them. As a matter of fact, my father's family, we lived more on the outskirts on a large plot of land, but my grandparents lived where the synagogue was, and that is referred to as the Schulhof, where I've seen similar setups in Israel when I've been there, where there are a lot of houses that are lined up in a square, and all the activities of community go on in that square.
Does this mean then that the shul or the synagogue would be right in the midst of that square?
That's correct.
These grandparents that you mentioned, they were the parents, they were your paternal grandparents. Did you see them frequently?
Yes.
what relationship did you have with them?
My grandparents were very Orthodox. My grandmother had a reputation. She came from a very rabbinic family, and really we call what we refer to, we don't believe a lot in it, but we refer to as yichus, which is describes the background of the family. Almost came more from her. She was from a very well-known and well-learned family. And she herself was a very pious woman. She had only had 4 sons, and probably many other women in that generation may have had more. So she spent her time doing a lot of mitzvot. The one thing I remember hearing about her was that she used to go to the train station to meet people that got off so that she could take them directly to her home and give them lodging, and hachnasas orchim was her big thing. But she was a very, very smart person, and I remember speaking to her. I vaguely remember shredding cabbage in her kitchen. And the hard part, that at the end you couldn't shred anymore.
Would the holidays be spent together with your grandparents?
I think probably some were, but a lot of holidays we went to my parents' family who lived in Czechoslovakia. We traveled there, especially for Pesach and Sukkot we spent in Salem, but Pesach we always went to my mother's family.
Tell me the names of first of all, your father's parents who lived near the synagogue. What were their names?
My father's mother's name was, I wasn't named for her. My name is Sarah Leah, but Bela, and that's my oldest daughter's name. Her name was Bela. She was referred to as Bella. My grandfather's name was Yaakov, my father's father. My father had 3 brothers. One of them, as I described before, was very steeped in learning, and the other 2 were more like my father. Eventually, one came to America, two went to Israel.
And what about your maternal grandparents? Tell me their names.
My mother's name was Nissel.
Your grandmother?
My grandmother, and her maiden name was Cohen, because I know some relatives on her side whose name is Cohen, and actually our oldest daughter is named for 2 grandmothers. Her name is Bela Nissel in Hebrew. My grandfather on my mother's side's name was Yisrael, and my oldest son is named for him.
And the last name again was?
Hollander. And my grandfather was a man who spent a great deal of time learning, although he had a grocery store, and he believed very much that in earning a living for his family. My mother came from a larger family. There were 7 or 8, 6 of whom were alive, and so he worked very hard to earn a living, but I know that I've been told that at 4 o'clock in the morning he used to get up to study Torah.
When you went to visit your grandparents in Czechoslovakia, by the way, where was it that they lived?
My grandparents lived in a famous town in Czechoslovakia. The name was Nitra, Nitra.
Where was that near?
It was near Prague, and there was a large yeshiva there. It was, I believe, a larger community than where Salem, and there was a large yeshiva and large synagogues. I remember them referring to a Neolog synagogue, which was what probably in Pittsburgh would be referred to as conservative, but my mother says it's more like Orthodox here. And
Was that the synagogue of your
No,
grandparents?
they probably went to a smaller place, which in today would be referred to as a Rebbe Stiebel, something like that.
What would you say your favorite holiday was as a child?
Well, all my life, my favorite holiday has been Shavuot, and it still is, because it's probably the easiest of all of them. The weather is the nicest, and the symbolism is flowers, so can't go very wrong.
Well, then, can you describe a Shavuos day from your childhood? Do you remember how it was celebrated when you were a child?
I really can't tell you the details. I do remember, I can't remember the details of a holiday because I know so much about holidays that I'm afraid I'm mixing it up with what I learned afterwards. I do remember traveling to my grandparents on Pesach, and I remember a few stories about how what my grandmother made or cooked. And
Can you tell me several of these stories?
I can tell you something about Pesach, which is possibly interesting, that is a little more involved than maybe you want to get into here. But
well, I want your experience.
But I will tell you that my grandfather probably was more of a Hasidic bent than my father's family. And so he would travel to his Rebbe, who was the Belzer Rebbe, on those holidays. It's most probable that he originated in Poland, where Rebbes were more in style than where my father came from, which was a truly Ashkenazic community.
Does this mean that when you went with your family to your grandparents for Passover, that your grandfather was away at the Rebbe?
I remember him being there when I was there, but I also remember hearing that he went away. I don't believe he went away for Passover. He may have gone away for Rosh Hashanah, but not for really family kind of holidays.
Back in Salem, what was the style for women in these observant communities in terms of going to the synagogue? When would they go to the synagogue?
There was no really, women, in my opinion, were quite liberated. They could go or they could stay home. There definitely was accommodation for them in the synagogue. However, usually they didn't feel that the necessity to go. The home was more the place where the Judaism was acted out.
Do you remember the synagogue, though?
I remember the little shulhof that I described. I don't actually remember ever praying in a synagogue. I remember praying at home many times, but not in a synagogue.
Who taught you the prayers?
We had a rabbi, a teacher, and I went to first and part of second grade, and the school that I went to was a Jewish school, and we had probably the same type of a setup that we have here in a day school, in the school that I went to.
That school that you went to for the first and second grade, was it a public school?
It was called a public school, but as far as I know, only Jewish children went to that particular school. My mother remembers in her youth that she went to an integrated school which was a kind of more like a Christian school. But the way I hear tell, I think mine was, they were all Jewish children.
Do you remember any relationship with non-Jews when you were a young child?
Oh, for sure, definitely. Yeah. I played with non-Jews, and they were in and out of our house all the time because of our business. They were a part of our life, although socializing with them was not done.
What did you mean by socializing?
I mean having dinner, or inviting them over to see our holidays, or inviting them to special parties. I do not believe that there was that kind of eating kind of together kind of a setup.
When you were a young child before the war, what activities did you enjoy taking part in, either at home or elsewhere?
Well, I remember reading, and I remember that I was promised that I would be playing the piano. I remember going to some kind of a dancing class, and I always liked to sing, so we did some of that.
When you say that you were promised that you would be playing the piano, did you have a piano at home?
We had a piano, however, I don't remember ever learning to play it.
In your house, what sort of cultural things went on? You mentioned reading. Was the reading necessarily of a religious nature? The reading that you did.
My mother was a reader, but I would imagine that the reading was done probably in German, but the material was probably mostly of a religious nature, or also to do with household things like raising children and recipes, things like that.
Mm-hmm.
The men stuck more to the Hebraic reading than they didn't read novels.
What did your brother do at the time that you were young? How much of a difference was
My
there
brother's
between
a year and a half older than I am. He has a physical disability which he was born with, and so his physical activities were limited, and he is a scholar today, and he always did a lot of studying.
What is your brother's name?
My brother's name is Hugo, Hugo in German or as in English, and in Hebrew his name is Moshe Chaim.
And at the time that you were little, before the war, and in that home, did he do any special religious study?
Yes, we had a rabbi that came to study with us, aside from what we learned in school.
When would you say that the situation began to change in your town or around you in terms of the impending war? What sort of things did you notice?
Well, what I noticed was Kristallnacht. That was my first really physical notice. I remember that very distinctly.
Okay, when we start the next tape, we will begin to talk about
Okay.
Kristallnacht.